And we are joined right now by Amia Srinivasan, professor of social and political theory at the University of Oxford and author of The Right to Sex, Feminism in the 21st Century. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, right off the bat, before we get a bit into the book, we probably should talk a bit about the news. And we have almost exhausted the topic on the show over the past week, but at the same time, there's always more that can be said. As a feminist writer and as a professor who's studied this for many, many years, what was your initial response when you saw that breaking news? Honestly, I think it was last Monday, because I remember where I was when I saw it, the leaked opinion coming out of the Supreme Court on Roe v. Wade.
Well, it was a combination of instinctive and quite personal horror. And I think that is recognizable to a lot of women, even though I don't live in the US anymore. I have very strong ties to the US and I grew up partly there, and it feels, I think, to most women, to the majority of women, like an intensely personal attack. The other emotion I had was horrified admiration for American conservatives. They have planned this for decades. They have been strategic, much more strategic than Democrats when it comes to thinking about the protection of reproductive freedom, and they've won. And I feel, of course, a lot of anger and horror at Alito, all of the conservative judges, the Supreme Court in general, which I think is a deeply flawed institution, all of the Republicans who made this happen. But I'm also very angry with all the Democrats who have allowed this to happen, since it's been so clear to anyone who's been watching for the last few decades that this has been the game plan all along.
Exactly. And frankly, the fact that they've been caught flat-footed is reprehensible. I'm reminded of a quote from Nancy Pelosi in 2017. Do we have that? Just really briefly, talking about how abortion should not be a front-facing issue for Democrats. Maybe if we just have the headline there, we can pull that up. But sorry for springing that on you guys. But that the fact that they seemingly have zero plan B. Yesterday, the Roe v. Wade codification bill predictably failed in the Senate that is not going to carve out a filibuster exemption for women's reproductive health and just their humanity, human rights. Nancy Pelosi said this in 2017, which is just shocking. I mean, frankly, Pelosi said Democratic candidates should not be forced to toe party line on abortion. She said it was, quote, fading as an issue for Democrats. That was in 2017. Now here we are, 5 years later.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Democratic candidates shouldn't have to toe the line on respecting women's bodily autonomy with resisting the onslaught against women, against trans people, against queer people, against poor people, predominantly poor people of color, immigrants. These are all of the people whom this will affect. And I mean, part of what I object to so much on Pelosi's line is the thought that, well, everyone keeps their own moral counsel about abortion. And I actually think that's pretty right. I think that people have the right to have, a view on what may be a fairly complicated moral issue on the question of, whether oneself would get an abortion. Of course, one never really knows until one is in those circumstances. The political question here, the legal question here, is a different question, right? Here's the tragedy behind this, is that abortions don't go down when it is criminalized. More women just die. Right. And that's what conservatives in this country, I'm sorry to say, want. I mean, what this is about is not simply about the control of women's bodily autonomy, although it is. It's also about penalizing any woman who wants to have non-reproductive sex, who wants to have sex for any reason apart from serving the patriarchal reproductive order, producing new bodies for the next generation.
Yeah, well, we're seeing, I mean, frankly, one of the dominating principles on the right is the commitment to punishment. And they want to punish trans people for existing, and they also want to punish women if they have sex outside of marriage, if they decide to take that into their own hands. I mean, it's no coincidence that we're now seeing discussion of perhaps we should ban IUDs in the morning after pill. The contraceptive that women have the most control over individually. A man might be able to see if you're taking birth control every day. I mean, although they'll come to that next. The birth control pill, I should say, condoms, etc. The man has more control over that. But the ones that a woman has control over, in that she has agency over, that's what they're going to target next, obviously.
Obviously, and it's so interesting, of course, because those are the two forms of contraception that were really at issue in the Hobby Lobby case, right? Which was one of the important building blocks to get us to precisely where we are today. But the horizon here isn't just abortion, right? It's about every right, constitutionally guaranteed right that the left and progressives have fought for, which have not been recognized for the long durée of American history, right? The right to racially desegregated schools, the right to gay marriage, the right to contraception. If you look at Alito's reasoning, if one can call it that, in the majority, what will be the majority opinion, one finds that it will just apply easily to all of those constitutionally, or what we should think of as constitutionally guaranteed rights. That's the long game here. It's reversing all of that, taking us back many decades.
100%. And I will get off this in a second, but just to return to Pelosi's statement there, what else is an organizing principle for Democrats if it's not protecting a woman's right to choose? Because frankly, leadership at least is not committed to really any broad economic policy set like Medicare for all or a Green New Deal. That's only the progressive wing. So what else do they stand for, frankly? And they still are allowing someone in their tent named Henry Cuellar and campaigning for him, frankly, who is an anti-choice Democrat. So it's a depressing time, and it's a good time to have you on to discuss these issues fairly broadly, because you make a point at the start of your book, and you emphasize it. Feminism is political, and thus sex is political in and of itself. Broad overview. Why did you feel it was necessary to emphasize that in a work of feminist theory and this collection of essays, which I'd encourage everybody to check out your book. It's really excellent. To me, that seems obvious, but I think to a lot of people it's not.
Yeah, I think to a lot of people it isn't, and I'm glad it strikes you as obvious. And what I want is, once you point it out, it should be obvious to people, right? So people tend to instinctively think as sex as just something that happens in the private sphere, in the home, which they also think of as not a place of politics, right? Politics is what happens at, in the Senate chamber or at the voting booth. And the home, meanwhile, is something that just needs to be protected from political inquisition. This is the very traditional understanding of the home, of married life, of sex, of the family. But of course, all of these things I've just mentioned, as the abortion debate shows so clearly, are actually central to the current political configuration. Right? I mean, conservatives have a very strong interest in the family taking a particular form, in sex taking a particular form. Just to connect the family to something that is a little less obvious to some people, when you think about debt and the way that privatized debt operates in the US, it couldn't operate the way it does if it weren't for the family, because you need parents to back those huge loans that children need to take out, young people need to take out to go to university. And you need the fear of your family being inundated with debt to get you to pay it back, right? So the family operates as this central important mechanism, even under what we call a neoliberalized economic vision, a vision which is supposed to be all about individuals, but actually is very often about the family.
You get a tax break if you're married. That's another way that the family is political, right? And if now gay couples, it's very likely, given the extremist Supreme Court, they could be excluded from that. That's a way that politics shapes family in a very direct way.
Absolutely. So all of these things need to be exposed as not merely personal. I'm not saying that people don't have strong personal investments, and I'm certainly not saying that they should just be subject to state inquisition and regulation. But we need to, as you were already saying, recognize that these are already political things, right? The way the family operates, what forms of sex are allowed and not allowed. These are all kind of political decisions that are being made, and we need to be making much more actively.
So you write in your book about how you look at some of these issues through a perspective of an older feminist lens that is not afraid to look at sex as political. In terms of feminist theory, when did that shift happen? When sex was viewed, at least in mainstream feminist theory, as outside of the political sphere? Because you would think that, you know, feminist thinkers, and I know there's a range of them if you're intersectional or if you're a white feminist, right? And the latter of which I'm quite critical of on this program. You would think that that would still be at the forefront, but what is the history of that? How did that kind of get obscured?
So I'll stick to the American case because I think it's what your viewers will be most familiar with, and it's a really good test case for this. So, you know, in the late 60s and 1970s, as the women's liberation movement is taking place in the US, you have this repoliticization of all sorts of things that have been understood previously to just be private: sex, abortion, contraception, the structure of the family, childcare, healthcare, education. And then what starts happening, however, for really good reason, is that by the time we get to the 90s, there's a kind of pushback against thinking of at least some aspects of sex as political. And people increasingly want to say, feminists increasingly want to say, no, look, you shouldn't actually subject the kind of sex people are having to political critique, so long as it's consensual, right? And so the kind of critique that earlier feminists wanted to offer, what they would say, look at the kind of sex that people are having. This isn't genuinely free sex. This is sex that's actually shaped by patriarchal expectations, according to which men are going to be in every way dominant and women are there to submissively serve men's pleasure. That's itself a political construct. Feminists increasingly in the 80s and 90s wanted to back away from that and wanted just to insist that, no, actually, as long as it's consensual, it's fine. Now, as I said, that's for some good reasons, right? There are dangers in subjecting sex to a kind of political critique and telling people that they shouldn't be having certain forms of sex, even if they're consensual, right? I mean, that's what conservatives do all of the time, right? They tell people they shouldn't be having consensual gay sex, or they shouldn't be having consensual non-normative sex, or consensual sex outside of the family or outside of marriage. And so some feminists started to feel that this kind of anti-sex feminism was authoritarian, right? It was trying to control women in kind of the same way that men had historically controlled women. So there was a kind of backlash against it. And we got the embrace of what's called sex positivity, right? A form of feminism that is supposed to be actively embracing all sorts of different forms of sex as long as they are consensual. But one of the things that I think has happened, and you can really see this by talking to like young women now, college-age women, high school-age women, is that sex positivity, which was supposed to be a liberating doctrine, has ended up making a lot of women feel pressured to just have a lot of sex on men's terms. So it ends up not really feeling freeing to them. So there's a kind of complicated dialectic here, but what you see is throughout this history, women trying to articulate what sexual freedom really means or might really involve. And what would it mean to have sex outside of a script that's just written by men?
So is part of that too just if feminist theory or sex positivity, I should say, and that concept, if it excludes itself from politics to that degree, or you're just, you know, all sex is, you know, if it's consensual, it's fine, right? And you make a kind of broad strokes argument about that. One, I think it obviously needs to be updated to include trans people, include non-binary people, etc. But two, you're kind of ceding the sexual political space to the right. And they, when you cede territory to them, they seize everything that they can, right? And you exit the political space to a degree. They fill that vacuum very easily. They're a minoritarian ideology, honestly, as particularly in the United States, and that's kind of inherent to how they seize power right now. So is that part of the fear as well?
That's such an interesting analysis. And to me, it makes really good sense of the incel phenomenon. And which I do talk about a little bit. I want to get into
that too.
Yeah.
Right.
So, because I think what you're saying is right. So you have on one hand, a kind of mainstream left understanding of sex where as long as it's consensual, it's fine. So basically it's a market ideology, right? So long as Amazon worker has contracted to be screwed over in the warehouse, then what Jeff Bezos is doing is permissible. And so you have a similar kind of market logic within sex. As long as it's consensual, it's fine. Intuitively, a lot of people chafe at this, right? Because you look at what actually happens in sex and you think, but there are weird hierarchies here. For example, there are racial hierarchies that say that people of certain races are more sexually desirable or have higher sexual status than other people. And I think one thing, and what happens is that there's a right-wing narrative that very easily steps into that gap. You see it from someone like Jordan Peterson, who offers you offers a young, dissatisfied sort of man, typically a diagnosis, right? And it's always a return to a mythical, traditional time when everyone was sexually satisfied because we had marriage, and that meant that no man had to go without sexually. Of course, whether this served women or not is kind of beside the point. But I think you're right that it's a sort of failure of the left, because actually feminists are well positioned in a sense to speak to incels, at least before they've gone totally radicalized. Because feminists can say to incels, you're right that a lot of the ways that the sexual marketplace works, the fact that it is a marketplace and it's seen as a place of trading status, that's messed up. That's not a really sexually free realm. But the ideology you're being pulled towards by someone like Peterson is the equivalent of, a member of the so-called traditional white working class, blaming immigrants or people of color for their objectively immiserated situation, rather than identifying the true culprit, which is, the capitalist oppressor, to put it, bluntly.
That's an incredible argument. I mean, the extrapolation of neoliberal ideology onto sexuality, I've never ever thought of it that way. But they're mirroring alienation. That's mirroring that kind of alienation that's driving people towards, as you say, demonizing ethnic groups on the political stage, but in terms of the incel community, demonizing women and looking for outside sources and groups for feelings of loss or listlessness or inability to connect in a society that makes it very hostile.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in both cases, what you also have is, on one hand, a kind of justified grievance at real phenomena, and then an unjustified grievance at the perception of a thwarted entitlement, right? So there's, on one hand, members of the so-called traditional white working class have very strong reason to be angry in the US about just the state of economic inequality, right? But they incorrectly think that what is happening is that racial minorities are doing better than they are, which objectively is just false, right? And there's something similar going on, I think, in the case of incels. They have a kind of justified grievance about, this sexuality and sex treated as this kind of status conferring commodity, but instead of But what they're really upset about is the fact that they're not getting what they think that they're entitled to, rather than offering a fundamental critique of the entire system.
100%. And I want to work backwards because the chapter about incels, which is also the same title of your book, comes after you both looking at, accusations of rape, which I want to get into, but pornography you also analyze through the evolution of feminist critiques of pornography, and also just in your conversations with your students as well, because I think this works well with what you were talking about sex positivity and feminism in the 1970s and 80s. We have to update it now, right? Because feminism in the 70s and 80s was also blanketly, porn is patriarchy. Porn is degrading to women. It's wrong, etc. And I think now feminists, intersectional, not just white feminists, have a positive and different view of sex work that is a marked shift from that perception in perspective, I should say, from the 70s and 80s. So do you mind taking us a little through that mini history and that evolution as well, and how pornography can be viewed in 2022 through a feminist lens, or how you view it as well?
Yeah. Okay.
It's a broad question, I understand.
So you're absolutely right that for especially American feminists, but to a lesser extent British and Australian feminists in the mid 1970s onward, they came to see pornography as the kind of like linchpin of patriarchy. They saw pornographic representation as the training ground for men's subjugation and abuse of women outside of pornography and outside the bedroom as well. So they, for example, drew a strong connection between sexual harassment in the workplace or unfair, unequal wages and pornography. It was pretty implausible then as an account of what was going on, because pornography then there wasn't an internet. You had to go into a store and go get a top shelf magazine, or you had to go to a blue CD theater. It just didn't have anything like the kind of ubiquitous role that it has now. But what's interesting is to revisit those debates now, when pornography really is pretty ubiquitous and where young people do have I say really ubiquitous. I think it's always important to remember that only about 50% of the world's population is online. So we're never actually talking. That's an important thing to remember. But I think arguably it's the case that young people now are much more formed by pornography than they used to be historically. Certainly when I talk to my students, they feel that the sexual script available to them was very much one written by porn. But I should say it's mainstream porn that they're talking about, because there's a huge amount of queer, independent, feminist porn that does not recycle very narrow, boring tropes of just male domination, female submission. The thing is, most of that porn isn't free. It's certainly not available on something like Pornhub. The story about 21st century pornography is a story about capitalism. It's about the domination of the internet by basically one company that has a monopoly and that uses mostly stolen content, right, to drive its traffic, has a very powerful algorithm whose function it is to bring different people's desires into conformity with each other. So if you write threesome, you're only going to get one kind of threesome, right? There's only going to be one distribution of the genders. And it's also really important to note that the existence of something like Pornhub has directly driven down the income of the women who work in porn, and it has also accelerated the rate at which they have to progress to more intensive, hardcore sex acts. So when we talk about 21st century porn, I think it's very important to name what kind of pornography worries us, and what sort of pornography might be more promising or liberatory or emancipatory. The one thing that I think we the one lesson we must learn from the 70s and 80s is not to try and look to the coercive power of the state to address any of these issues.
Yeah.
So, you know, in the feminists in the mid 1970s onwards, famous for drafting forms of legislation that didn't try to criminalize porn, but did try and make it subject to civil litigation. Hugely well-intentioned, really bad idea in practice. The reasoning that Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon put forward behind their ordinances was taken up wholesale by the Canadian Supreme Court, who made this decision, this very important decision called Butler, that said that pornography, sorry, what exactly did it say? It said that that ruled out that said certain forms of pornography constituted criminal obscenity, right? Okay. And then within a few months, what happens is Canada's first gay and lesbian bookshop, Glad Day Bookshop, is found guilty of criminal obscenity. Because that's what the state does when you give them these laws. It doesn't go after the mainstream big porn giant. It goes after the queers and the gays and trans people. And, you know, and so whatever we think we need to do or we don't need to do about porn, reaching to the carceral state is not the answer.
100%. And when you talked about how, you know, Pornhub steals content, it's like this, I guess, monopoly on pornography. What is your take on OnlyFans as a, you know, it's a fairly recent phenomenon and as a response to it? Because my understanding is that you cannot repost OnlyFans content. It is, say you're to record it and put it on another website, you're violating their terms or potentially the law. I don't really know. This is a kind of, I'm figuring it out as I'm talking about it. But at the same time, that really just applies to the company of OnlyFans, right? Yeah. Not the individual creators. So that's the sex workers working on OnlyFans. They are not owning their own material. It protects OnlyFans, even though in theory it sounds like a less exploitative practice versus Pornhub.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly the right diagnosis. So I think OnlyFans better on the whole than something like Pornhub, in part because sex workers, you know, a lot of people who would practice in-person sex work, forms of, you know, what's called prostitution, moved on to OnlyFans, and that often, not always, is physically safer. But of course, the problem with OnlyFans is that it's not owned by sex workers. What you want is an OnlyFans that is run by a sex workers cooperative, right? But you need big servers, right? And your server can never go down. Disaster. You need a huge amount of startup capital. Who has that kind of money available? Are sex workers, is a cooperative of sex workers going to be able to call on that startup capital? Absolutely not. I shouldn't say absolutely not. I'm optimistic. Sex workers and sex worker cooperatives are some of the most politically imaginative and organizationally astute people I've come across. And so if anyone was going to do it, I think sex workers would. So OnlyFans ambivalent, and sex workers are precarious on OnlyFans, right? Think about what happened when the major credit card companies started saying that sex workers had to get off. Think about forms of legislation. I mean, there's a piece of legislation in California right now moving through the legislative process, trying to get sex workers off OnlyFans. So there isn't fundamental security unless workers own the means of production.
100%. It was interesting too how OnlyFans, in order to appease their investors, they were like, we're going to ban sex work, and then they faced so much pressure and they had to reverse it. And you just have to imagine that you would never have that issue if this was a cooperative and it was actually owned by the workers putting in the labor on OnlyFans. I want to, since we're working backwards, go to your first essay where we can talk about Me Too and accusations of rape. You open talking about false accusations and then also about true ones and how power plays into that. Was that a deliberate choice by you, given just, how I think some people are grasping at a way to find the boundaries of this conversation or the rules, because of false accusations of rape do happen, but you have to look at how power, race, etc., plays into that. Did you do that on purpose to maybe bring people in who might be skeptical or uneasy about the movement's rules or lack thereof?
Yeah, it was a very deliberate decision on my part. So I actually opened the book opened that chapter, which is the first chapter of the book, by talking about two cases that I know of that I think are plausibly cases of false rape accusations. And I think my guiding thought here was feminism has nothing to fear from this. False accusations, of course, they happen. But it's not some trump card, right? And I think so many people want to treat it, so many men who want to talk about Me Too going too far, or the evils of feminism in general, want to treat this like some sort of trump card. And it's very important, I think, that feminists have something to say about it. And there's a lot to say about it. I mean, first thing to say is that they are very, very rare. That's what all the statistics suggest. All of the studies that have done that tend to over-exaggerate the rates of false accusation because they draw their data from police departments who are generally in the grip of various kinds of rape myths. So police departments will very often say that an allegation was false if there was no weapon present or no evidence of a physical struggle. We, of course, know that those don't need to be present for rape to occur, usually aren't. But the other thing to say is that false rape allegations, when they happen, especially in the US, tend to happen against men of color. And those false accusations tend to be brought by other men. And the other men they tend to be brought by are the police, right? Because the paradigm structure of the false rape allegation in the US isn't a vengeful woman accusing a man of something he didn't do. It's an actual crime has occurred, an actual sexual assault has occurred, and the police coach a false witness identification, or just arrest someone who is also Black but isn't actually the person who committed the crime, and induces a false confession. So that's if we're really worried about false accusation, we should be worried about the racialized nature of policing and the criminal justice system in the US. And there's fewer statistics on this, but on the whole, the prison population in the US is made up of poor people. And I would be shocked if it weren't the case that working class men and poor men were much more susceptible to false rape accusations than middle class and wealthy men. So our paradigm of who we think of as the victim of the false rape accusation is totally wrong.
Well, because it's wealthy white men using obscuring the realities and the power dynamics of the paradigm that you say, and extrapolating it onto their entirely different situation in order to get away with crimes. And you write this, and I just thought it was so well said. There's no general conspiracy against men, but there is a conspiracy against certain classes of men. Mm. And that is, I think that is the major takeaway that people should take away from the Me Too movement, to be inherently, I think, to believe women, yes, and especially in instances when it's about powerful men, because of all of those conditions that you describe.
Absolutely.
So, can you talk and expand a little bit more on the muscle memory that's been created in the United States in particular? I know your book focuses on many different countries, but we're running out of time, and I wanted to touch on this point. The portrayal of Black people in America black men, you touched on it before, they're portrayed as rapists. Women are not to be believed if they were raped, black women, I should say. And how that dynamic and that long history that comes from slavery and white supremacy has been exploited and continues to be exploited in 2022.
Absolutely. I mean, the great Angela Davis talks about how the time-worn myth of the Black rapist has as its flip side, the time-worn myth of the unrapeable Black woman, right? So the idea is this Black woman who is so sexually promiscuous, so asking for it, that to have sex with her could never be a violation, right? So unrapeability here paradoxically generates increasing rape.
And sorry to cut you off, but we've played a clip on the show of Thomas Jefferson's descendants who cast aspersions on the notion, right, Matt, that
total denial
of, and claiming it was consensual between Jefferson and his slaves. That's one example of it as well. But
yeah,
continue.
fantastic, right? Yeah. So and that notion of the sort of unrapeability of Black women is very alive. I mean, you can look at the sociological studies on this. So I mean, there's this, for example, young Black girls are just seen as sexually promiscuous, not having any of the kind of innocence and purity of young white girls, and so that's part of the reason why R. Kelly, right, wasn't held accountable for his actions for so long, right? I mean, one of the jurors at his trial, a white juror at his trial, actually says that he just didn't believe any of these Black girls, right? These sexually promiscuous Black girls, that they had been subject to sexual violence by R. Kelly. And the kind of tragedy of this, as you see in various cases like the R. Kelly case or the Justin Fairfax case, is that the white mythology about Black sexuality has created actually a tension sometimes between Black men's need to exonerate themselves and Black women's need to be able to speak truly about the sexual violence that they do sometimes suffer from men of their own race. And that is one of these problems and dilemmas that something like an intersectional feminism helps us with, or helps us at least to analyze, even if it doesn't help us, even if it's not obvious in the first instance what to do about it.
Lastly, you talk about how believe women and people who, say, well, what about this case? Or, men can be abused too, 100%, right?
Absolutely.
100%. But when people say, well, don't believe women all the time, people are innocent until proven guilty, they're conflating a critique of injustice historically with a legal principle. And do you mind fleshing that out a little bit, so maybe people have a bit of a guide to navigating this conversation with somebody who might bring that up?
So the presumption of innocence is a really important legal principle. It's a principle of legal justice, not just in the American legal system, but in many places around the world. And, the idea is that it's worse to let a guilty person go free than it is to punish an innocent person. And so we deliberately in the legal system stack the deck in favor of innocence, right? We presume it. And then the accuser, usually the state, has to reach a certain level, a fairly high threshold of evidence to be able to prosecute. I mean, that's in the ideal situation. Obviously, there are lots of miscarriages of this principle all over the place, especially when it comes to people of color and immigrants and poor people. But that principle, right, innocent until proven guilty, that's a legal principle. There's a separate question, sorry to sound too philosophical here, there's an epistemic question of just what you should believe, right? And what should we have believed about Harvey Weinstein, right, before the case was done, right? When you read just the credible testimony, credible, coherent, consistent testimony of dozens of women, right? produced by a very careful investigation. Were we really supposed to just wait until the case was done? Absolutely not. The rational thing to do is to conclude that in all probability, he is guilty of various forms of sexual violation. That is distinct from the question of how to try someone, right? So that move, that innocent until proven guilty move, is only ever played in some cases, right? It's a political move. It's not actually someone invoking a genuine principle. It's someone trying to shield people from a certain class, a certain group, from critical, skeptical scrutiny.
Can't thank you enough for your time today. Amia Srinivasan, Professor of Social and Political Theory at the University of Oxford and author of The Right to Sex, Feminism in the 21st Century. I'd encourage everybody to buy that book and check it out. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be here.
It was great.